In this video, I'm going to talk about the mm, Sigheh marriages historically in modern Iran. I'll begin with the Qajar dynasty and the fact that Sigheh marriages were used as tools for various political purposes at this time. For instance, one way Sigheh marriages were viewed was a measure to avoid gender segregation as opposed to being a mere sexual release. Although pleasure and gratification in a legal context were still used as reasons for Sigheh, and men might still bring Sigheh wives home as maids for their formal wives, other times these sexual liaisons would only last for a few hours. According to feminist historian Janet Alfari in her wonderful book, Sexual Politics in Modern Iran, it became apparent that Sigheh was also heavily class-based. Women in the lower status, the strata of the society, for example, worked for the bazaris or the marketplace businessmen and provided them with an income source through Sigheh. These same bazaris only approved of Sigheh for their own daughters if the man involved in this Sigheh contract was of a higher social status, but they would contract out their employees who relied on them financially to anyone with any social status. Sigheh was a great source of income for clerics too, who approached the worst women or widowed women and made the arrangements for them to become Sigheh wives for men on pilgrimage, for example. While socioeconomic factors such as these were important, they were not, however, the only reasons for women to become involved in Sigheh marriages, as Qajar royal princesses used to contract Sighehs too. Yet, whatever the purpose of the temporary marriage was and whatever purpose it was used for, it was generally in the service of a patriarchal system. At the turn of the 20th century, Iran witnessed major economic deterioration. During this economic decline, polygamy and having to support multiple households became too expensive for men who turned to monogamy because they could not support more than one wife, and because monogamy was also associated with modernity. Now, the emergence of these modern gender norms, such as monogamy, transformed the public's view of the institution of marriage. After that, monogamy became the norm for the elite too, as it had always been for men from the lower social class. With the fall of the Qajar dynasty in 1925 and the rise of the Pahlavi monarchy, a new era began. Women became a part of the state structure where they could promote ideas of gender equality from within the government, which made their message all the more legitimate in the eyes of the society. Immediately after he came to power, Reza Shah instituted several gender-based reforms, such as opening employment and education opportunities for women as part of his overall focus on modernization. This increased women's access to and presence in the public sphere, which effectively ended gender segregation in Iran. Reza Shah's regime prioritized, however, a major health campaign as state policy. At the same time, Sigheh, like sex work, was viewed popularly as the reason for the spread of venereal diseases in medical and legal circles, even though clerics denied any link between Sigheh marriages and venereal diseases and opposed any measures taken by the state that would curtail male sexual privilege. Now, clerics argued that men who contracted Sigheh marriages would not visit sex workers and would therefore not spread venereal diseases. Reza Shah's government was only focused on traditional marital hygiene, population control, and sex work. It did not address concerns about Sigheh and the spread of venereal diseases in Sigheh marriages. Even the Marriage Act of 1931, which required pre-marriage health certificates from men, did not curb infection rates, and it still permitted polygamy, even though it required the registration of civil marriages. After Reza Shah, his son Mohammad Reza Shah embraced the liberation of female sexuality even more than his father. The 1967 Family Protection Law, قانون حمایت خانواده, curbed men's unilateral right to the divorce and granted women some freedom in their marital life. Now men had to ask for their first wife's consent to be able to marry another woman. The court also began deciding parental custody rights. In 1975, the Family Protection Law also changed the age of marriage to 18 for women. Despite such dramatic changes, these reforms mostly affected women in urban and middle class communities, while the institution of marriage remained much the same in many poor, rural, and urban communities. Although monogamy was still the norm in rural and migrant communities, Sigheh still existed because it functioned as a source of income as well as a sexual outlet for clerics and some Bazari businessmen. Gender reform was often seen as an act of government, but it would not have happened without the awareness campaign that took shape outside the state. The greatest obstacle on the path for women toward liberation was their upbringing with traditional old-fashioned ideas. But women's rights activists such as Mahnaz Afkhami managed to raise women's awareness and consciousness and transform their feelings of submissiveness. Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah's sexual policies, in which they advocated for women's social and political activism, gave life to a new generation of women who began to demand not only their social, political, and legal rights, but also their sexual rights. These were women who demanded equal rights in marriage, divorce, and child custody. In short, these women were more outspoken about their rights to assert their rights as women and demand greater freedom. And a good example of this is Forough Farrokhzad, whose poems were sexually provocative and became the subject of much intellectual debate. Farrokhzad's popularity among young women indeed indicated a dramatic change in the consciousness of women that is often referred to Iran's second wave of feminism, a wave that moved past legal rights into existential issues of self and pleasure. In contrast to the forces that focused on women's reform only in terms of family protection law, the cultural and social changes that took place during the Pahlavi regime provided the possibility for greater freedom for women, including the right to quietly engage in consensual sexual relations. Now, this was this progress and this emancipation of women was not held by all sectors of the society and all sects of the society. So a lot of different groups came together against the Pahlavi regime from all walks of life, and the religious group took control and emerged as the leaders of the 1979 revolution, which had grave implications for women. The Islamic Republic, in its own turn, aimed to rebuild gendered apartheid through the reintroduction of dress code, segregation of public spaces, the um, introduction of um, some new laws into the family protection law, and cancellation of the reforms originally made, which had taken 5 decades to accomplish. In the aftermath of the revolution, a purification campaign was started to eradicate urban professional and more secular women from the public who, according to Ayatollah Khomeini, were quote unquote corrupt manifestation of the monarchical regime and the West. First on Khomeini's agenda was to purify Iran of any Western influence, and though curiously, this Western influence was defined selectively and never included modern warfare and other technologies that helped the regime solidify its grip on power. This purification began in Tehran's red light district, whose female inhabitants were arrested and imprisoned or sent to rehabilitation centers where they were given the necessities of life, but forced to help with the chores and eventually to contract Sigheh with the Revolutionary Guards or a veteran from Iran-Iraq war. There has been also anecdotal evidence that some were rehabilitated and employed as female prison guards, and some became part of Hezbollah goons who enforced the dress code. And a good example is the Fatih Commandos represented in Tahmine Milani's Nimeh Penhan, or the Hidden Half, produced in 2001. After the revolution, Sigheh was encouraged by the state, and the public pulpit of the Friday prayers became a platform from which clerics were able to encourage it. Sigheh was presented as a savab, or heavenly reward, and as a means to prevent social and sexual disorder. Now, before I move to the period during the Iran-Iraq war, here I want to just interject and mention that during the Pahlavi regime, during Mohammad Reza Shah's time, Sigheh marriages and contracting Sigheh was very prevalent in pilgrimage zones, and sex workers were placed in a red light district called Shahr No, which was like a colony of itself away from the center of the city. So this was the red light district in Tehran that Khomeini basically bulldozed. What I'm trying to say is that Pahlavi regime was not very much concerned with Sigheh marriages at the time. So after the Iran-Iraq war, many women who had initially supported Khomeini's regime became disillusioned. Now, they called into question the legitimacy of individual policies that were advanced under the guise of Islam. Since more women were educated in religious matters at this point, they began to question the official reading of Quran. And prominent lawyers such as Mehrangiz Kar and Shirin Ebadi, though opposed to Islamist policies, shared their legal knowledge with Islamist women in helping them to articulate greater gender equality. Together, the feminist lawyers and Islamist women demanded another reform of the family protection law. Under the new regime, women had virtually become objects that belonged to their husbands without full citizenship rights of their own. And as women became more educated, they became more selective in choosing their husbands and realized more suitable partners might not be available. So many turned to Sigheh out of loneliness and financial desperation at this time. and an increase in widowhood from the war, high divorce rates, and female unemployment augmented the pool of women available for Sigheh marriages. During the war and after the war, then President Hashemi Rafsanjani promoted Sigheh as a means to solve the socioeconomic problems of young war widows. However, temporary marriage was still primarily a tool in the service of male superiority because it was an informal, even though legal, relationship between a man and a woman who were not yet viewed as equals. Most women for whom temporary marriage was their best option were from lower economic and social strata. So temporary marriage during and after the Iran-Iraq War was another factor in maintaining gender and class-based inequalities that emphasized female passivity. In favor of Sigheh, Hashemi Rafsanjani used Sigheh as a justification to critique the suppression of female sexuality, even though his critique was still within the framework of Islamic law. The public discussion about Sigheh, female sexuality, and female body not only made Sigheh visible, but it also broke various taboos related to sexuality. In this way, men and women's association through Sigheh became sanctioned. These policies helped to loosen the state's tight hold on Iranian youth. Young Iranian men and women experienced a sexual freedom that was new in Iranian society. Unfortunately, this does not mean that they necessarily practiced safer sex. While such policies were favored by unmarried youth, Rafsanjani's invitation to sex through Sigheh created a rift between married men and married women. The middle-class public and women's rights organizations were also against this bolstering of Sigheh. Naturally, the encouragement of Sigheh placed married women's private lives increasingly at risk. By Islamic law, Muslim men have the right to marry 4 women formally, which is in itself a source of insecurity for women, for their wives. Now, with this public endorsement of Sigheh, women and wives, married women, felt even more insecure. To many, it was the solution the state offered for sex work, so the popular opinion viewed Sigheh as legalized sex work behind the facade of legality or religion. Whereas Rafsanjani encouraged single men to marry war widows, expectations of female virginity at the time of first marriage also strongly persisted. Rafsanjani's solution for war widows did not function as intended. According to sociologist Akbar Aghajanian, it was and still is dishonorable for a man, especially a single man, to marry a non-virgin divorcee. Due to this stigma, the best alternative for widowed or divorced women was to marry a widowed or divorced man or to become the Sigheh or mistress of a married man. Unsurprisingly, in Afari's words, many urban middle-class women, even though they abhorred Sigheh, began to use the practice to their own advantage for reasons of social mobility or financial advancement. They became Sigheh of men affiliated with the state who could provide them with posh lifestyles. They kept these liaisons secret. However, due to the social stigma attached to the custom, particularly for women. In addition to utilizing temporary marriage to solve social problems associated with war widows, Islamic Republic encouraged Sigheh as a measure to circumvent the social and sexual disorders. In the 1990s, media, the internet, television, and newspaper advocated Sigheh as an alternative to Western-style dating, masturbation, or visiting sex workers for Iranian youth. Under these policies and public discussions of sexuality, sexual mores began shifting. Society became less religious and more secular, and premarital sex became the trend in urban areas. Some young men and women started using Sigheh to their advantage to avoid state restrictions enforced locally by the morality guard. Sigheh's trial marriage also became common for young men and women who wished to get to know each other before nikah marriage. During the 2000s, the state offered to open chastity houses or khane efaf for members of the Pasdaran, Basij, and war veterans, where they could use Sigheh with sex workers. However, this proposal faced much criticism and the bill never passed. It was proposed that Khaneh-e-Faf would provide a room in a designated house or a hotel for those who wanted to contract Sigheh. This was presented by the state as another measure to reduce the rates of venereal disease and sex work on the streets. While this specific bill never passed, Sigheh remained legal and its practice continued to contribute to sex work and venereal disease. Many sex workers use Sigheh to avoid persecution by the morality police. The state continued its policies of giving men unrestricted access to sex through polygamy, the unilateral right to divorce, and unlimited temporary marriages while denying the same to women. Afari's research demonstrates that since 2000, thousands of girls have run away from home every year and subsequently fall into sex work. Of the young women who fall into sex work, 1/4 are contracted into Sigheh first. During Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency, Sigheh once again made headlines in Iran as Iran's solution to its social problems. In 2007, Ahmadinejad's interior minister encouraged Iranian youth to enter Sigheh marriages without their parents' knowledge. The public responded to this advice with strong resistance. Ahmadinejad released a statement clarifying that the interior minister's offer should be viewed as a cleric's proposal rather than a state representative's. Religious and pilgrimage zones continued to be centers for sex work through Sigheh. And most men and women continued to keep their highly stigmatized Sigheh marriages secret. The clerics continued to promote Sigheh by emphasizing its marital aspects rather than as a means for sexual release. However, the middle-class Iranian population continues to this day to view Sigheh as a legalized sex work. In 2007, the parliament also proposed several reforms to a number of important articles in family protection law, including Articles 16, 17, 18, 22, 23, and 25. Article 22 of the bill proposed the removal of the requirement to register Sigheh, hence removing women and children's financial and legal rights in Sigheh marriages. In August of 2008, almost a year after the bill was first drafted, hundreds of women, activists, and feminists, including members of the 1 million signature campaign, Shirin Ebadi and Simin Behbahani, met with parliament members to express their disappointment over the change to the bill. As a result of this public opposition, the bill was sent to the Parliamentary Judicial Committee for further revisions. After 3 years of controversial debates, while earlier opponents such as Ebadi were either in exile, in jail, or free on bail, the bill once again appeared on the parliament's agenda in 2010. However, this time, initial supporters of the government also joined the women's rights lawyers and activists opposing legislation. For instance, referring to the Quran, Zahra Rahnavard pointed out that polygamy, a central issue promoted by the new law, arose in a specific historical and cultural context. In this historical society shaped by war, the Prophet endorsed temporary marriage, yet the bill in question is misinterpreting this context. Rahnavard argued that the bill is not just a woman's issue, but also the entire nation's concern due to the significance of the family unit in Iranian society. Activists claimed that the bill would only reinforce the discriminatory laws against women already deemed second-class citizens. However, supporters of the bill, such as legislator Mohammad Khan, argued that the bill would defend the rights of women who were not able to have nikah or formal marriages for various reasons, including undesirability due to age and being worn out. Ultimately, the Article 23 was deleted from the draft bill. Between 2008 to 2013, the bill was discussed several times. In 2013, it was made law. The first wife's permission is not included in the law as an obligation for a man wanting to take a second wife. Using a highly stigmatized custom of Sigheh, the Islamic Republic attempted to police sexuality and resolve the social sexual disorder in the country under the facade of religious customs, but ultimately those attempts failed. The state's policies not only placed the educated youth at odds with the state, but they also complicated matters of virginity for families. What family members previously decided now seemed to be in the hands of the state. In essence, the state has put itself in between parents and their children. Whereas during the Pahlavi era, female sexual liberation was seen as a threat to establish gender norms, under the Islamic Republic, the spread of Sigheh marriages is considered the cause of the breakdown of the patriarchal family structure. The youth never accepted the state's invitation for proper sex through Sigheh. Instead, the family unit in the form that it existed, that is a heterosexual marriage for the purpose of marital life, procreation, and familial relationships, was weakened. Temporary marriage as a contractual union offered an alternative that does not strengthen the relationship between two people because the cost of divorce or separation in such marriages is minimal. Rather, temporary marriage, which is proposed as a solution for men who cannot afford to marry formally, only benefits men, because temporary wives are most often breadwinners of their households. If a child born into a temporary marriage and the man cannot provide for the child, or the man does not accept or acknowledge paternity, he is excused from the responsibility, placing all the burden, including financial burden, solely on the woman. However, despite all these negative implications that temporary marriage has for women, I have to reiterate and emphasize that the practice has survived for a reason, and it does benefit certain group of women.